Hi, today's book is called The Muqaddimah. It's written by an Arabic author named Ibn Khaldun. It was written around the year 1377. A lot of people tag this author as a sociologist and historian. I just call him a philosopher. So I just like him because he's a great writer. The Muqaddimah is a great book, especially since it's written over 640 years ago. For me, it's easier to read than a lot of Greek authors like Plato and Aristotle. This guy, he just is a great writer. When I read first-person accounts of history from the ancient times, and I feel kind of a synchronicity with that person who's writing, even though his culture was so different, his civilization was different. He lived in the time of dynasties, whereas I live in the United States and we have a government, it's called a state, which is set up by laws and the Constitution. He lived in a time of dynasties, which were more personality driven. But still, I can appreciate his thinking. The reason why he's such a great writer is because he's such a great thinker. So this has 6 chapters, and at the beginning chapters he talks about geography and the different latitude lines around the globe. He talks about how the civilization differs for people in different latitudes on the globe. For one thing he points out is that it's so hot in the equator because it's so close to the sun that it's hard for an advanced civilization to develop along the equator. Because of the heat. It just changes the way people live. The climate and the soil and the access to water, it all affects the level of civilization at that latitude. And he also says the latitude affects the character of the people who live in that latitude. Then on chapter 2, he moves into the Bedouin culture. And he's very familiar with the Bedouin culture. He points out some of the characteristics of it, and one of them is they have this sense of face. You always have to save face, and you have to protect your face in social situations. Now, the Bedouin people, he brings in the concept of group feeling, and that's what brings strength to the Bedouin people. The Bedouins live at a very low subsistence level. For example, they just put up tents, they roam around. He never uses the word nomad, but that's what they are. They move around. He points out how the Bedouins are very proud and very jealous people, and it's hard for them to agree with each other. So they don't have many crafts like blacksmiths or agriculture. They can live with a minimal amount of liquids and food, and they don't really build things. They don't have much, laws. They have their own morals. It's a very low-level society. Then one of the ways that a dynasty grows is that these people join together and have a group feeling. And with this group feeling, they get strength. And one of the things that happens is they accede some of their personal power to the leader of the group. And then the group can start to flourish and rise. At this point, he starts to develop the concepts of the dynasty and how the dynasty grows and what happens through the dynasty after different generations. I think he calls a generation 40 years. He has a very general way of looking at things, but he mentioned some dynasties that he has specific knowledge of during his time and before his time. I never heard of these dynasties. Here's some examples right here. So I had to make a decision to kind of gloss over the details of these dynasties. But his observations are very good. He's a very confident writer, and he's a very persuasive writer. Everything he wrote, I was like, oh, I believe you. I believe everything this guy wrote. The guy really can write. He's got a very musical way of writing. He packs a lot of information into a sentence, but it's more about, it's a lot about feelings of people and the way communities work. He's a real humanitarian. He's an incredibly intelligent man. And in his time, he was a political advisor. and I can see why he was successful. He's so far more intelligent than I am, but when he writes like I'm at his level. I'm not at his level. He's way more intelligent than I am. The way he writes, he brings me up to his level, and that's charming, and that makes me feel good. And it does raise my level when someone more intelligent than I am puts me on their level. So that is just extraordinary. It's one of those books where I feel like I could easily read it again and get even more out of it after a second reading. The word to describe him is eloquence. This guy is one of the most eloquent writers. And the fact that no one ever talks about him kind of amazes me, because he should be talked about. So I'm going to share a few things just to give you a sample of what he writes about, what he's interested in. Okay, so when he talks about the different generations in a dynasty, he says, the builder of the family's glory knows what it cost him to do the work, and he keeps the qualities that created his glory and made it last. The son who comes after him had personal contact with his father and thus learned those things from him. However, he is inferior to him in this respect, inasmuch as a person who learns things through study is inferior to a person who knows them from practical application. The third generation must be content with imitation, and in particular with reliance upon tradition. This member is inferior to the second generation, inasmuch as a person who relies upon tradition is inferior to a person who exercises independent judgment. The fourth generation then is inferior to the preceding ones in every respect. Its member has lost the qualities that preserve the edifice of its glory. He despises these qualities. He imagines that the edifice was not built through application and effort. He thinks that it was something due to his people from the very beginning by virtue of the mere fact of their descent, and not something that resulted from group effort and individual qualities. For he sees the great respect in which he is held by the people, but he does not know that respect originated and what the reason for it was. He imagines it was due to his descent and nothing else. He keeps away from those in whose group feeling he shares, thinking that he is better than they. He trusts that they will obey him because he was brought up to take their obedience for granted, and he does not know the qualities that made obedience necessary. Such qualities are humility in dealing with such men and respect for their feelings. Therefore he considers them despicable, and they in turn revolt against him and despise him. They transfer leadership from him and his direct lineage to some other related bunch, in obedience to their group feeling, after they have convinced themselves that the qualities of the new leader are satisfactory to them. His family then grows, whereas the family of the original leader decays, and the edifice of his house collapses. So this is the very fundamental thing that he points out, and he goes into detail about it, how these dynasties occur, and they're basically personality driven, not so much like by laws. There is religious law, as opposed to our government in the United States, which is based on laws of the Constitution. These are dynasties based on personalities, and they can only last so long. One of the things is when dynasties change, they often destroy the previous dynasty, so they never really build much. Now he goes further into the division of the different generations, and how the first generation is kind of a savage generation, and then as the next generation occurs, more luxury appears, and this softens the people. So in the earlier generations, the group feeling is so strong that the people will want to fight to protect their dynasty, but in the latter generations they might hire out soldiers to fight to protect their dynasty. And also another sign of a deteriorating dynasty is when the leader does not want to see people. It's really difficult to see the leader because he gets really paranoid, and he gets rid of people, even his family members. So that's a sign of the deterioration. Furthermore, luxury corrupts character. Through luxury, the soul acquiring diverse kinds of evil and sophisticated customs, as will be mentioned in the section on sedentary culture. People lose good qualities that were a sign and indication of royal authority. They adopt the contrary, bad qualities. This points toward retrogression and ruin according to the way God has planned for his creatures and his connection. The dynasty shows symptoms of dissolution and disintegration. It comes affected by the chronic disease of senility and finally dies. The purpose of human beings is their religion, which leads them to happiness in the other world. These kind of concepts are very different to the way that we live in the United States in our secular society, where there are many people who don't even believe in God at all. It should be known that in Muhammad's opinion, all of this world is a vehicle for transport to the other world. Another point that I like, that he really is concerned about injustice. They're not just savage people. He is very concerned with injustice. He has great feeling for the people in the dynasty. Injustice should not be understood to imply only confiscation of money or other property from the owners without compensation and without cause. It is commonly understood in that way, but it is something more general than that. Whoever takes someone's property or uses him for forced labor or presses an unjustified claim against him or imposes upon him a duty not required by the religious law does an injustice to that particular person. People who collect unjustified taxes commit an injustice. Those who infringe upon property commit an injustice. Those who take away property commit an injustice. Those who deny people their rights commit an injustice. Those who in general take property by force commit an injustice. It is the dynasty that suffers from all these acts, inasmuch as civilization, which is the substance of the dynasty, is ruined when people have lost all incentive. This is what Muhammad actually had in mind when he forbade injustice. He meant the resulting destruction and ruin of civilization, which ultimately permits the eradication of the human species. This is what the religious law quite generally and wisely aims at in emphasizing 5 things as necessary: the preservation of religion, the soul life, the intellect, the progeny, and property. Before I end, I want to read this section that I really enjoyed in this book. Like I said, Khaldun goes through many different subjects, and toward the end he has a section on education, which I really enjoyed. It was just so smart, so perfect. The right attitude in scientific instruction toward the method of giving such instruction. It should be known that the teaching of scientific subjects to students is effective only when it proceeds gradually and little by little. At first, the teacher presents the student with the principal problems within each chapter of a given discipline. He acquaints him with them by commenting on them in a summary fashion. In the course of doing so, he observes the student's intellectual potential and his preparedness for understanding the material that will come his way until the end of the discipline under consideration is reached. In the process, the student acquires the habit of the science he studies. However, that habit will be approximate and weak one. The most it will do is enable the student to understand the discipline and know its problems. The teacher then leads the student back over the discipline a second time. He gives him instruction in a higher level. He no longer gives him a summary, but full commentaries and explanations. He mentions to him the existing differences of opinion and the form these differences take all the way through to the end of the discipline under consideration. Thus, the student's scholarly habit is improved. Then the teacher leads the student back again, now that he is solidly grounded. He leaves nothing that is complicated, vague, or obscure unexplained. He bears all the secrets of the discipline to him. As a result, the student, when he finishes with the discipline, has acquired the habit of it. This is the effective method of instruction. As one can see, it requires a 3-fold repetition. Some students can get through it with less than that, depending on their natural dispositions and qualifications. We have observed that many teachers of the time in which we are living are ignorant of this effective method of instruction. They begin their instruction by confronting the student with obscure scientific problems. They require him to concentrate on solving them. They think that this is experienced and correct training, and they make it the task of the student to comprehend and to know such things. In actual fact, they confuse him by exposing him to the final results of the discipline at the beginning of his studies and before he is prepared to understand them. Preparedness for and receptivity to scientific knowledge and understanding grow gradually. At the beginning, the student is completely unable to understand any but a few points. His understanding is only approximate and general and can be achieved only with the help of pictures derived from sensual perception. His preparedness then keeps growing gradually and little by little. When he faces the problems of the discipline under consideration and has them repeated to him and advances from approximate understanding of them to a complete higher knowledge. This habit of preparedness and eventually that of attainment materialize in the student until he has comprehensive knowledge of the problems of the discipline he studies. But if the student is exposed to the final results at the beginning, while he is still unable to understand and comprehend anything and is still far from being prepared to understand, his mind is not acute enough to grasp then. He gets the impression that scholarship is difficult and becomes loath to occupy himself with it. He constantly dodges and avoids it. That is the result of poor instruction and nothing else. The reader should not ask more for the student than that he understands the book he is engaged in studying, in accordance with his class, age group, and his receptivity to instruction, whether he is at the start or the end of his studies. The teacher should not bring in problems other than those found in a particular book until the student knows the whole book from beginning to end, is acquainted with its purpose, and has gained a habit from it, which he can then apply to other books. When the student has acquired the scholarly habit in one discipline, he is prepared for learning all the others. He also has become interested in looking for more in advancing to higher learning. Thus, he eventually acquires a complete mastery of scholarship. But if he confuses a student, he will be unable to understand. He becomes indolent and stops thinking. He despairs of becoming a scholar and avoids scholarship and instruction. Wow, that is just great. Thanks for watching.